In the quiet town of Oak Haven lived two sisters, Alara and Lyra. Their houses stood only a few blocks apart, close enough to wave from their porches, but they hadn't exchanged a single word in what felt like forever. Years had passed since a small disagreement, something about a borrowed sweater and a spilled drink, had somehow puffed up into a giant, unshakable grudge. It was the kind of silly fight that grown-ups sometimes have, where neither person really remembers how it started, just that they're very, very mad. Ilara, with her garden full of bright, colorful flowers, often wondered if Lyra ever looked at them. Lyra, on the other hand, spent her days baking delicious pies and cakes, always making an extra one, then sighing and putting it away, knowing Ilara wouldn't come by for a slice. The silence between them was like a heavy blanket over their small, peaceful town, a quiet reminder to everyone that even the closest of bonds could break. They moved through their lives, side by side but a world apart, each holding onto their hurt, unknowingly waiting for something big enough to shake them awake. The quiet hum of Oak Haven was suddenly broken by an urgent message on every radio and TV. A massive hurricane, stronger than any in living memory, was headed straight for them. The news sent a shiver through the town, replacing the usual peaceful rhythm with a hurried scramble. People rushed to stores, boarded up windows, and filled sandbags. Ilara heard the warnings and immediately began her own preparations. She checked her generator, bought extra batteries, and stocked up on non-perishable food. Her focus was entirely on her own house, securing her colorful garden, and making sure her home was as safe as possible. She didn't spare a thought for Lyra, or if her sister was doing the same. Across town, Lyra also heard the news. With a grim face, she started her own hurricane drill. She taped her windows, brought in her porch furniture, and filled jugs with fresh water. She worked with a determined efficiency, her mind solely on protecting her own space. The idea of reaching out to Ilara, even with a storm coming, didn't cross her mind. Their old grudge had built such a strong wall between them that even the threat of a natural disaster couldn't easily break it down. They moved through the preparations like two separate islands, each fighting their own battle against the coming storm. The hurricane arrived with a fierce roar, tearing through Oak Haven like a wild beast. Wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain hammered against windows, sounding like 1,000 tiny drums. Trees bent and snapped, their branches flying like toothpicks. It was a night of pure terror, each gust shaking homes to their very foundations. When the sun finally dared to peek through the bruised clouds, it revealed a scene of chaos. Oak Haven was a mess. Houses were ripped apart, roads were blocked by fallen trees, and power lines lay tangled like discarded spaghetti. Ilara emerged from her home to a heartbreaking sight. Her vibrant garden was flattened, buried under debris. A huge oak tree had crashed onto her roof, leaving a gaping hole in its wake. Inside, water dripped steadily, pooling on her wooden floors. The cheerful hum of electricity was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Her phone, a lifeline to the outside world, was dead, just a black rectangle in her trembling hand. She felt utterly alone, surrounded by the wreckage of her once beautiful home, with no way to call for help. The weight of the storm and the sudden isolation pressed down on her. Across town, Lyra's home had been lucky. The damage was minor. A few broken shingles, some downed branches in the yard. She had power, at least for now, and her phone even flickered with a single bar of service now and then. But as she surveyed the town's devastation from her window, a knot of worry tightened in her stomach. Despite their years of silence, the image of Ilara, alone in her more exposed house, kept flashing in her mind. Lyra tried to push the thought away, telling herself Ilara was strong, capable. But the worry clung to her like the damp air after the storm. What if Ilara needed help? What if she was hurt? The old arguments felt tiny and foolish now, dwarfed by the sheer force of the hurricane. Finally, Lyra couldn't stand it anymore. She found a small piece of paper and a pencil. With a shaky hand, she wrote a short message. "Are you okay, Elle?" She folded it carefully, tucked it into a plastic bag to keep it dry, and set out. Navigating the debris-strewn streets was slow and difficult, but she pressed on, driven by a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: concern for her sister. Reaching Alara's damaged door, she carefully taped the little note to the splintered wood, then hurried back home, a mix of hope and fear churning inside her. The day after the storm, Alara felt lost in the quiet ruin of her home. Every task felt too big, every thought too heavy. She walked to her front door, intending to push aside some debris, and that's when she saw it. Taped to the splintered wood, a small plastic bag shimmered. Inside, a folded piece of paper. With a mix of confusion and curiosity, she pulled it free. Her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting. "Are you okay, Elle?" It was Lyra. Alara stared at the simple words, a jumble of emotions swirling inside her. Surprise was the first. Lyra had come all this way, through the storm's aftermath, just to leave this? Then came a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: warmth. It was a tiny spark in the cold, dark loneliness that had settled over her. This wasn't a demand or an accusation or another reason to argue. It was just concern. Pure and simple. She traced the L with her finger, a strange lightness filling her chest. It was the first kind word, the first sign of caring she had received from her sister in what felt like forever. In the midst of so much destruction, this small, damp note felt like a fragile bloom, a tiny promise that perhaps not everything was broken beyond repair. It didn't fix her roof or bring back the power, but it did something more important. It eased the ache in her heart, just a little. The small note had been a comfort, but it couldn't fix Alara's broken roof or bring back her electricity. As the hours stretched on, the reality of her situation pressed in. She needed help. Taking a deep breath, and holding on to the fragile hope Lyra's note had sparked, Alara decided to brave the journey to her sister's house. Each step was a challenge, navigating fallen branches and puddles that hid unseen dangers. The once familiar path now looked like a foreign land. When she finally neared Lyra's street, a familiar figure came into view. Lyra was outside her house, a hammer in her hand, struggling with a section of her wooden fence that had been torn down by the wind. She was pushing and pulling, her brow furrowed in concentration, her usual neat hair now escaping its braid. Alara stopped, hidden partly by a large, overturned bush. She watched Lyra for a moment, a strange mix of old resentment and new understanding bubbling inside her. Lyra looked tired, but determined. It was a familiar sight, this stubbornness, a trait they both shared. The image of Lyra, working alone to mend her fence, made Alara's own troubles feel a little less unique. The thought of speaking to her, however, still felt like crossing a vast ocean. The words Alara wanted to say, the apology for the silence, the thanks for the note, all caught in her throat. The years of not speaking had built a wall of awkwardness, even taller than their grudge. She watched Lyra struggle with the fence, her own hands itching to help, but her feet stayed rooted. Then, an idea sparked. Before leaving her damaged home, Alara had carefully wrapped a few things from her fridge that wouldn't last without power. A fresh apple, a small block of cheese, and a handful of crackers. It wasn't much, but it was all she had that was still good. Quietly, Alara crept closer to Lyra's house, making sure to stay out of her sister's line of sight. Lyra was still wrestling with a stubborn piece of wood. With a swift, silent movement, Alara placed the small bundle of food on the corner of Lyra's porch, right where she would surely see it. It was a silent message, a gesture of thanks for the note, a small offering in a world turned upside down. Without looking back, Elara quickly moved away, disappearing behind another cluster of fallen bushes and trees, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. It felt both scary and right to leave the gift, a tiny bridge across the chasm of their silence. After a while, Lyra finally gave up on the stubborn fence post. Her hands were sore, and her brow was slick with sweat. As she turned to go inside for a drink of water, her eyes caught on something unexpected on her porch. A small bundle, carefully placed. She picked it up. Inside, an apple, a piece of cheese, and some crackers. Her heart gave a little flutter. She knew instantly where it had come from. Elara. Only Elara would leave such a thoughtful, quiet offering. It was a clear sign, a silent thank you for the note she had left earlier. A wave of understanding washed over Lyra. Elara had been here, had seen her, and had chosen this way to communicate. A deep sigh escaped Lyra's lips. The years of anger, the stubborn pride that had kept them apart, suddenly felt incredibly foolish. This small act of kindness, born from the chaos of the storm, spoke louder than any words. She felt a sharp pang of regret for their long argument, for all the lost years. It was a regret not just for the fight itself, but for the silence that had followed, for the wall they had built between them. The food wasn't just sustenance. It was a bridge, a quiet invitation to mend what had been broken. The next morning, the town rallied. A call went out for a community cleanup, a chance for everyone to help clear the wreckage and begin putting Oakhaven back together. Despite their separate preparations, both Elara and Lyra felt the pull of their community and showed up. Elara joined a group clearing debris from the main street, lifting heavy branches and bagging soggy leaves. Her muscles ached, but the shared effort felt good. She caught glimpses of Lyra down another street, helping neighbors stack damaged roof tiles. They were both there, shoulder to shoulder with others, but still separated by an invisible wall. Throughout the day, their paths would sometimes cross. Elara would see Lyra passing by with a wheelbarrow full of broken wood, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes focused. Lyra would spot Elara struggling with a stubborn tangle of vines, almost stepping forward to help before hesitating. They never spoke, never even made eye contact for more than a fleeting second, but the knowledge of the other's presence was a constant, quiet hum. Each was aware of the other's efforts, a silent acknowledgement that they were both still part of this town, and, in a way, still part of each other's lives. The shared hardship was slowly, subtly, chipping away at the edges of their long-held silence. The afternoon sun was warm, drying the damp earth and lifting spirits. People chatted as they worked, a sense of shared purpose filling the air. Elara was helping clear a pile of splintered wood near the old town gazebo when a sudden, sharp crack echoed through the air. Everyone froze. From a partially collapsed shed nearby, a heavy section of roof, loosened by the storm, groaned and then tumbled with a terrifying crash. A collective gasp went up as a small child's cry pierced the sudden silence. A little boy, no older than 5, had been playing too close to the shed and was now pinned beneath a large piece of corrugated metal. Panic flared. Without a moment's thought, both Elara and Lyra reacted. They were on opposite sides of the debris field, but their eyes locked for a split second before they both sprinted towards the sound. The years of silence, the grudges, the awkwardness, all vanished in an instant. All that mattered was the child. Elara reached the debris first, trying to heave the heavy metal. Lyra was right behind her, her face set with fierce determination. They didn't speak, didn't plan. They just moved, driven by an instinct far older and stronger than any sibling rivalry. Elara grabbed one end of the heavy metal sheet, her muscles straining. Lyra immediately took the other, her strength surprising. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, not with anger, but with a shared, urgent purpose. 1, 2, 3, lift! Lyra grunted, her voice hoarse. They heaved together, a synchronized effort born from years of unspoken understanding. The metal scraped against the ground, shifting just enough. "I can reach him," Elara cried, quickly kneeling to pull the crying child free. She scooped him up, a small, trembling bundle, and held him close. He was scared, but thankfully unharmed. As the child was passed to his relieved parents, Elara and Lyra stood side by side, breathing heavily. The old teamwork, honed from childhood games and shared chores, had resurfaced effortlessly. It was as if no time had passed, no harsh words exchanged. They had moved as one, anticipating each other's actions, a silent dance of rescue. In that moment, the weight of the debris felt less heavy than the years of silence they had just broken. Not with words, but with action. The ease with which they had worked together was a powerful reminder of the deep connection that still lay beneath their hardened feelings. With the child safely returned to his parents' arms, the immediate panic faded, replaced by a wave of relief. Elara and Lyra stood together for a moment, their chests heaving from the exertion. The dust settled around them, and the sounds of the community cleanup slowly resumed. Then, Elara turned to Lyra, and Lyra turned to Elara. Their eyes met, truly met, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was no need for words. In Elara's eyes, Lyra saw the fear of a moment ago, the tired but gentle concern for the child, and a flicker of the old affection that had once bound them so tightly. In Lyra's eyes, Elara saw the fierce determination that had helped lift the heavy metal, the worry that had prompted the note, and a deep, quiet understanding. It was a shared look, a moment outside of time, that said everything they couldn't voice. It spoke of shared history, of unspoken apologies, of forgotten grudges, and of an undeniable connection that even years of silence couldn't erase. No lengthy explanations were needed. The unspoken language of sisters passed between them, a silent promise to begin mending what had been broken. It was a look that felt like coming home. That evening, as twilight painted the damaged town in shades of bruised purple and orange, a soft knock came at Elara's door. She opened it to find Lyra standing there, a large pot in one hand, a bag in the other. The aroma of something warm and delicious filled the damp air. "I made stew," Lyra said, her voice a little shy, her eyes meeting Elara's. "And I brought some bread. Thought you might be hungry." Elara, whose stomach had been grumbling all day, felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Lyra," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped aside, letting her sister into the dim, damaged living room. They sat on overturned crates, the flickering light of a battery-powered lantern casting long shadows. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the warm food a balm to their tired bodies. Then Lyra spoke, not about the old fight, not about what had kept them apart, but about the immediate, pressing needs. "Your roof," Lyra began softly. "It looks bad. We can probably tarp it tomorrow, get some of the water out." Quote. Elara nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "And your fence," she replied. "I saw you struggling. I can help you fix it." Quote. It was a conversation about helping, about fixing, about working together. The old grudge, still a shadow, was momentarily pushed aside by the urgent, real need for connection and support. They talked about what needed to be done, about neighbors who needed help, about the town they both loved, and in doing so, they began to talk to each other again, truly talk, for the first time in years. The next few days were a blur of hard work and quiet understanding. Elara and Lyra became a team, their old rhythm easily found. They started with Elara's roof, pulling back the heavy oak branches and laying down a temporary tarp to keep the rain out. Lyra, with her practical mind, directed Ilara on how to secure the tarp properly, while Ilara, with her strength, did the heavy lifting. Then they moved to Lyra's fence, working side by side, hammering new posts into the ground and reattaching the broken planks. They didn't talk much about their past, but their hands and eyes spoke volumes. They shared water bottles, passed tools without asking, and occasionally offered a tired smile. Beyond their own homes, they joined forces in the wider community. They helped clear a path to the local clinic, brought supplies to an elderly neighbor whose house was hit hard, and even helped organize a makeshift kitchen for those without power. The town, battered but not broken, was slowly coming back to life, piece by piece. And with each nail hammered, each branch cleared, each kind word shared with a neighbor, the sisters found themselves rebuilding more than just homes. They were rebuilding a connection, brick by brick, act by act, finding strength in their renewed bond. As the days of shared work turned into a week, a subtle but powerful shift occurred between Ilara and Lyra. The constant physical activity, the shared meals in dusty, damaged homes, and the quiet camaraderie with their neighbors all worked to soften the hardened edges of their long-held resentment. They found themselves talking more easily, exchanging observations about the cleanup efforts, and even sharing tired jokes. One afternoon, while patching a neighbor's shed, Lyra paused, wiping sweat from her brow. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "that argument we had about the sweater and the drink. It seems so small now, doesn't it?" Ilara hammered another nail, then looked at her sister. "Tiny," she agreed, a faint smile touching her lips. "Like a speck of dust compared to all this." She gestured around at the wrecked town. It was a quiet admission, but it carried the weight of years. They both realized, with a clarity born from hardship, that the flimsy excuse for their grudge had been blown away by the hurricane. Their sisterly bond, woven from childhood memories and shared blood, was a sturdy cable, not a delicate thread. It had survived the storm, even if their homes hadn't. The disaster, in its harsh way, had stripped away the unimportant things, leaving behind the powerful truth of their connection. Slowly but surely, Oakhaven began to mend. The debris was cleared, temporary repairs were made, and the comforting hum of electricity returned to more and more homes. As the town healed, so too did the quiet rift between Ilara and Lyra. The forced closeness of the disaster had chipped away at their stubborn silence, revealing the warm, familiar connection beneath. They found themselves spending evenings together, not just planning repairs, but sharing cups of tea on Lyra's undamaged porch, or Ilara's temporarily tarped one. Little by little, the awkward pauses grew shorter, replaced by easy conversation. One night, while recounting a funny mishap during the cleanup, Ilara let out a genuine, hearty laugh, a sound Lyra hadn't heard from her sister in years. Lyra joined in, remembering a similar moment from their childhood. They began to tell old stories, tales from their younger days, about mischief they'd gotten into, secrets they'd kept, and dreams they'd shared. Each memory pulled them closer, weaving back together the threads of their shared past. The weight that had settled between them for so long began to lift, replaced by a lightness, a comfort that only sisters can truly share. It was like finding a lost piece of themselves, a familiar melody returning after a long, silent night. One balmy evening, as the stars began to sprinkle across the recovering Oakhaven sky, Ilara and Lyra sat on Lyra's porch. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. After a comfortable silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets, Ilara took a deep breath. "Lyra," she began, her voice a little shaky, "about that sweater and the spilled drink. I was so silly to let it turn into such a big thing." Lyra looked at her, a gentle smile on her face. "No, Ilara, I was just as stubborn. I should have just let it go. And I should have called you, all those years ago." The words, so long unsaid, hung in the air, light and freeing. "I missed you," Elara confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I missed you too," Lyra replied, reaching out to squeeze her sister's hand. "I'm sorry, Elara, for everything." "I'm sorry too, Lyra," Elara said, tears welling in her eyes. It was a heartfelt apology, not just for the initial argument, but for the years of silence, the pride that had kept them apart. The weight lifted from their shoulders felt almost physical. The old grudge, once a monstrous shadow, now seemed like a forgotten toy, small and insignificant. In its place was the warm, comforting presence of a sister, rediscovered and cherished. With apologies exchanged and years of hurt acknowledged, a profound sense of peace settled over the sisters. They sat for a while longer, on the porch swing, the gentle creak, a comforting rhythm. Lyra leaned her head on Elara's shoulder, a gesture they hadn't shared since they were children. "It's funny," Lyra murmured, "how it took a hurricane to make us see straight." Elara nodded, her gaze fixed on the mending town lights twinkling in the distance. "All that fuss over nothing, when we could have been here for each other. It really makes you think about what matters." They both understood. The storm had ripped through their town, leaving destruction and hardship, but it had also, in a strange twist, cleared away the fog of their anger. It had shown them that material things could be replaced, but relationships, especially family, were precious and fragile, needing care and attention. The feeling of utter isolation Elara had felt when her home was damaged, the deep worry Lyra experienced before leaving the note, these were stark reminders of the importance of connection. The disaster, for all its terror, had been a harsh teacher, stripping away their pride and revealing the unwavering truth that family was their anchor, their truest home. From that evening on, the bond between Elara and Lyra wasn't just mended, it was reforged, stronger and more precious than ever before. The awkwardness had vanished, replaced by an easy comfort and a deep, shared understanding. They weren't just sisters by blood anymore, they were sisters by choice, bound by the lessons learned from both the storm's fury and their own stubborn pride. Their renewed closeness didn't go unnoticed in Oakhaven. Neighbors who had long known of the sisters' silent feud watched with quiet admiration as Elara and Lyra worked side by side, shared meals, and walked arm in arm through the recovering town. Their story became a quiet legend, a hopeful whisper among the townsfolk. If Elara and Lyra can put aside their differences after all these years, people would say, then maybe there's hope for our own arguments. They became a living example that even the deepest rifts, the longest-held grudges, could be healed. Their empathy for each other, sparked by crisis, grew into a beacon of reconciliation for others in their small, resilient community. Their bond was a testament to the power of forgiveness and the unbreakable strength of family. The sun shone brightly on Oakhaven, a beacon of hope after the darkness of the storm. While repairs continued, a new spirit of togetherness filled the air. Elara and Lyra, now inseparable, were often seen together, whether organizing another community project, sharing a laugh over coffee, or simply sitting on one of their porches, enjoying each other's company. Their gardens, though still recovering, were tended side by side, a colorful testament to new beginnings. The old grudges were not just forgotten. They were replaced by a deep well of love and understanding that had always been there, just buried under years of pride and silence. The disaster, in its brutal honesty, had stripped away all the unnecessary layers, revealing the core truth. They were sisters, and that bond was unbreakable. They continued to be pillars of strength in their community, offering help and a listening ear. But now they did it together, as true sisters. Their journey served as a powerful reminder to everyone in Oakhaven that even in the face of immense loss and hardship, the most important things, like family and forgiveness, can not only survive but also flourish, making life richer and stronger than before.